Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling someone truly iconic, a figure really wrapped in layers of myth. We're diving into the sources on John F. Kennedy.
JFK, yeah. The charismatic president, the whole Camelot image, but also a man whose life was cut short and whose time and power, those famous 1,000 days, came at a huge personal cost.
Exactly. And that myth-making, that's really why we need this deep dive, isn't it? To sort of peel back those layers.
It is. We've got a good range of material here covering, his whole life. From that privileged but frankly quite demanding childhood.
Demanding is one word for it.
Right. Through to the health issues, the ones he fought so hard to hide, relentless, and then, of course, the president itself.
So our goal here, our mission, if you like, is to get past that dazzling image, the youth, the vigor, the charm. It's all true, but it's not the whole picture.
Not at all. We want to understand the real JFK, a man driven by, incredible ambition, but also this almost grim certainty that his time really felt that.
That sense of urgency, yeah, that comes through strongly. I mean, achieving what he did despite being constantly seriously ill, it's remarkable.
It really is.
So where do we start tracing that ambition? It has to begin with the family, doesn't it? That environment he grew up in. The sources call it the Kennedy Crucible. Yeah, the Kennedy household. Yeah. It sounds like it was just incredibly intense, dominated really by the father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.
Oh, absolutely. Joe Sr. was this powerhouse figure, embodied that early 20th century American financial drive.
Built a fortune in banking, finance, property.
And Hollywood, which is fascinating. He wasn't just investing. He was actively restructuring things. He famously pulled together several failing movie companies, streamlined them, and basically created RKO Pictures.
So we understood image and media.
Deeply. He got wealth from it, sure, but also this really sophisticated grasp of public relations, of shaping a narrative, and he definitely used that later for his son's political ruthlessness.
And the message to the kids, all 9 of them, was crystal clear.
Unambiguous. The line that gets quoted is, "We want no losers in this family, only winners."
Wow. Not just advice then, more like a command.
Pretty much. It turned everything, family dinners, sports, everything, into this intense competition. External success, winning, that was the currency.
But the intellectual side, the sort of academic anchor, they came more from his mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy.
That's right. Rose was very intelligent, college-educated, daughter of a Boston mayor, devout Catholic. She was sharp. Academically, some say, maybe even sharper than Joe Sr. in her youth.
And Jack, John F. Kennedy, he clearly got that side of her, the more thoughtful, cerebral quality.
Yes, you can see that inheritance. It set him apart a bit from his father, and definitely from his older brother, Joe Jr.
But the marriage itself between Joe Sr. and Rose wasn't exactly a fairy tale, was it?
Far from it. Joe Sr.'s affairs were constant. And not exactly secret either. I mean, the story about him having Gloria Swanson, the huge movie star, over to the house during their affair.
That's pretty brazen. So how did Rose handle that, especially as a devout Catholic where divorce was, unthinkable?
She developed this incredible stoicism, like an armor. Yeah. Absolute discretion was key. Maintaining that outward image, the successful Catholic family, that was paramount.
And she coped personally how?
She took frequent short trips, often alone or maybe with friends or her sisters, little escapes you could call, a way to get away from the pressure of 9 kids and managing that public face alongside her husband's relentless ambition.
That ability to compartmentalize, to keep up appearances, sounds like a trait Jack himself learned pretty well later on.
He absolutely mastered it. It became a crucial political skill for him. Hashtag Holler2 1.2, the second son in the shadow.
So you have this intense family dynamic, the dominant father, the stoic mother, and then there's Jack, the second son, always kind of living in the shadow of Joe Jr., the older brother.
Yeah, Joe Jr. was the golden boy, confident, athletic, looked like his dad, talked like his dad, completely bought into the winner mandate. He was the heir. Jack was different, often sick as a kid, quieter, more introspective, curious. Not the natural athlete Joe Sr. probably, but he read constantly, voracious.
And that's where he found his escape, in books.
Seems like it. Histories, biographies, and apparently he had this real fascination with the King Arthur legend, the Knights of the Round Table, Camelot.
Camelot, that's obviously quite resonant later.
Very. And this difference between the brothers, Jack seeking his own space, it fueled this lifelong, really intense rivalry with Joe Jr. They fought a lot.
Was Jack's introspective nature also shaped by anything else early on?
Well, there was the tragedy of his sister Rosemary, born just 16 months after Jack.
She had an intellectual disability, didn't she? Thought to be from oxygen deprivation at birth.
That's the belief, yes.
Yeah.
And Rosemary needed a lot of attention. That, combined with Joe Jr. being the clear favorite, probably pushed Jack even further and became more self-contained. Books were reliable, controllable, unlike the family dynamics.
It sounds like a coping mechanism.
Born out of necessity, you could say. Finding his own world.
The family started in Brookline, Massachusetts, near Boston. But they moved to New York, to the Bronx, when Jack was about 10. Why the move? Just business for Joe Sr.
Business was part of it, being closer to Wall Street, but it was also social and, could argue, political. Joe Sr., despite his success, was very aware of the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic prejudice that still existed in boss circles.
Even with all their money and power.
Oh, yeah. Certain doors just weren't open to them, or at least not as wide as Joe Sr. wanted for his son's futures. He saw New York and maybe just the mobility wealth offered as a way to break free from those old Boston constraints, to position the boys for national power, not just local.
Okay, so Jack moves into his teens, and that physical fragility we talked about, it doesn't get better. It actually gets worse, becomes this constant state of chronic illness. If we want to understand his drive later, we really have to grasp the pain he lived with. Hashtag tag 2.1, the lifelong battle with health.
Yeah, the sources are pretty stark about it. It wasn't just the usual childhood stuff like measles or chicken pox, though he had those too. It was these recurring, mysterious, severe illnesses.
How severe are we talking?
We're talking about averaging something like 2 long hospital stays every year for things like dramatic weight loss, terrible hives, crippling stomach pains, jaundice. Doctors were often baffled.
And it took a long time to even get a name for what was wrong.
Years. Eventually, one major diagnosis came through that explained a lot of the digestive problem, ulcerative colitis. It's a chronic inflammatory bowel disease, causes painful ulcers, really debilitating.
But there was something else too, diagnosed even later.
Yes, and this is absolutely fundamental to understanding JFK. In his late 20s, he was finally diagnosed with Addison.
Okay, for listeners who aren't familiar, what exactly is Addison?
It's an endocrine disorder. Basically, your adrenal glands, these little glands on top of your kidneys, they fail. They don't produce enough of essential hormones, cortisol and aldosterone. These hormones regulate metabolism, blood pressure, how your body handles stress.
So without medication?
Without synthetic hormone replacements, the body essentially starts to shut down. It's incredibly serious, life-threatening, if not missed.
So he was dependent on drugs, probably steroids included, just to function day to day.
Absolutely. Constant medication. And the symptoms themselves, even with treatment, could be brutal. Extreme fatigue, muscle weakness, joint. Plus, he had this chronic bad back from playing football.
Yet he hit it so well. He projected this image of vitality.
He became a master of disguise, really adopted that stoicism, maybe learned from his mother, rarely public.
And that's where the dark humor comes in, as a shield.
Exactly. Instead of complaining or inviting pity, he'd make jokes about it. His private letters apparently are full of these darkly funny, sometimes quite crude, descriptions of painful treatments or clueless dogs. It was a defense mechanism.
But rooted in something.
Rooted in this deep-seated belief, something he apparently told friends, that he wouldn't live past 5. He genuinely thought he was living on borrowed.
Wow. That certainty, that sense of limited time must have been a powerful motivator for his political hurry.
A tremendous motivator. It explains a lot about his urgency, his drive to achieve things quickly, hashtag tag 2.2 education, and political awakening.
Okay, so he's got this brilliant mind, reads constantly, great memory, but his actual school career at, shall we, the prep school, it didn't exactly start with a bang, more like a charming slacker.
That's a good way to put it. He was a bit of a rebel against authority there. Always late, room was a disaster, famous for wearing rumpled clothes, odd socks.
So not exactly striving for top grade.
He kind of coasted, earned what they called the gentleman's C in subjects he wasn't interested in. But crucially, his teachers saw the potential. They noted his natural intelligence was off the charts. Great memory, articulate, especially good at history and English, the subjects he acted.
Some sources suggest he almost deliberately avoided working too hard, maybe to avoid competing directly with Joe Jr. on grade, found other ways to stand out.
That's possible. He certainly found camaraderie and maybe distinction in mischief. He started this group, the Muckers Club, apparently named by an exasperated headmaster.
The Muckers. What did they get up to?
Classic boarding school practical jokes, but maybe taken up enough. The famous one is stealing a life-size cardboard cutout of the actress Mae West and putting it in the housemaster.
Did they get...
Oh, they came very close. But Jack's charm apparently helped smooth things over again.
But his real education, the thing that really shaped his thinking, wasn't Chayat. It was Europe, wasn't it? When his father became ambassador to the UK.
Absolutely. That appointment changed everything for Jack's development. Europe basically became his real-world political science seminar.
He traveled a lot.
Extensively, often on these informal fact-finding missions for his dad. He even crossed into Czechoslovakia from Germany right before the war, just trying to gauge the atmosphere. He met key figures, politicians, thinkers, including Winston Churchill.
Churchill must have made an impression.
Huge one. Jack admired his political resolve, but also that Churchill was a serious writer, a historian.
And this whole experience, traveling, seeing Europe on the brink, it fundamentally shifted his own political views, didn't it? Away from his father's isolationism.
Dramatically. It was a complete ideological pivot. His senior thesis at Harvard, which he wrote based on this experience, was called Appeasement in Munich.
And that became his first book.
Exactly. Published as Why England Slept. It was a mass success, a bestseller. And in it, he totally rejected his father's view that America should stay out of Europe's problems.
What was his argument?
Based on his travels, his interviews, his reading, he argued forcefully that the U.S. had a moral duty and a strategic necessity to defend democracies against Hitler, against totalitarian. He aligned himself squarely with FDR's internationals.
And the book's success gave him something his father's money couldn't buy.
Precisely. Intellectual credibility on his own terms. It was a huge step out from the family shadow. Hashtag tag 2.3 war heroism and deepening tragedy.
So World War II breaks out. Despite the terrible back problems, the Addisons, all of it, Jack is determined.
Absolutely. And here's a fascinating. Joe Sr. uses his influence not to get Jack a safe job behind a desk.
Which you might expect, given his health.
Right. But instead, he pulls strings to get Jack into a combat, a PT boat in the Pacific, which seems incredibly risky.
Why would he do that? If he demanded winners, why risk his son's life like that?
Because for the Kennedys, winning also meant demonstrating courage, honor, especially for an Irish Catholic family still fighting for full acceptance in the WASP establishment. They needed to prove their patriotism, their willingness to sack. A combat role offered that chance.
And then came the PT-109, which really cemented that hero image.
It was an unbelievable ordeal. August 1943, his boat gets rammed by a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night, just sliced in two.
How many survived?
2 crewmen died. Jack himself re-injured his back badly, but he immediately took charge of the 11 survivors in the water. Many couldn't.
And they had to swim for miles.
3.5 miles.
Yeah.
In the dark, through waters known for sharks, to reach a tiny, deserted island.
And the story about him towing the injured crewman.
It's incredible heroism. Machinist mate Patrick McMahon was badly burned, couldn't swim on his own, so Jack clinched the strap of McMahon's life vest teeth and towed him for hours. 4, maybe 5 hours.
Just unbelievable resolve. How did they finally get rescued?
They were stranded for almost a week. Jack eventually managed to carve a message, an SOS, onto a coconut shell. He gave it to some local Solomon Islanders who were paddling by in a canoe, fishermen who risked their own lives to take it to an Allied base.
And that act earned him medal.
The Purple Heart for his injuries and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. It absolutely validated the family's expectation of courage. Joe Sr., interestingly, kept the news quiet from the rest of the family for the week Jack was missing to spare them the agony.
But the war brought more tragedy soon after. The loss of Joe Jr.
Yeah, that was a devastating blow in 1944. Joe Jr., the golden boy, had already flown his required number of combats, 25 of them. He could have gone home.
But he didn't.
He volunteered for this incredibly dangerous experimental mission called Operation Aphrodite, or Anvil, using B-24 bombers packed with explosives as essentially remote-controlled flying bombs.
But
the plane exploded prematurely over England before he could even bail out. Killed him instantly.
Why did he volunteer for something so risky? Jack had his suspicions, didn't he?
Jack apparently believed Joe Jr. felt overshadowed by the PT-109, that maybe this incredibly dangerous mission was his way of reclaiming the spotlight, of being the bigger hero, that relentless Kennedy competition, even in war.
God, the pressure. And then, layered on top of this public loss, came the final hidden tragedy concerning Rosemary.
Yes. Rosemary's fate is probably as she got older, into her early 20s, her behavior apparently became more difficult to manage, more aggressive outbursts, mood swings, alongside her intellectuality.
And Joe Sr. and Rose made a decision.
A catastrophic one in hindsight. They consented to a prefrontal lobotomy. This was around 1941, maybe 42. It was a relatively new procedure then.
What were they hoping it would?
Doctors claimed it could calm her erratic behavior, make her more manageable. The procedure involved severing nerve connections in the brain's frontal lobe.
And the result?
Utterly devastating. It didn't just calm her. It essentially destroyed her personality. She was left permanently incapacitated, nonverbal, unable to read or write, needing constant care for the rest of her life, like an infant, mentally.
And the family kept this secret.
Joe Sr. was apparently horrified and ashamed by the outcome. He sent Rosemary to live in institutions, first a psychiatric hospital, then a facility in Wisconsin. And he told the younger siblings, well, he didn't tell them the truth for decades, just that she was unwell or living away somewhere.
That's heartbreaking. A profound trauma hidden beneath the surface of all that ambition and success.
It really underscores the immense pressure and the sometimes brutal choices made in the name of protecting the family image and ambition. The cost was enormous.
Okay, so Joe Jr. is gone. The war is over.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the family's political hope, Joe Sr.'s ambitions, they all land squarely on Jack's shoulders.
Right. And remember, Jack's carrying that belief he doesn't have long, so the pressure, internal and external, must have been. Joe Sr.'s first move was actually to get him a job as a journalist.
Covering big post-war events.
Yeah, things like the founding conference of the United Nations, the Potsdam Conference with Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, or Attlee by then. It was like a crash course in post-war international.
Now, what did Jack make of it all? His dispatches from that time, do they show his thinking?
They really do. You see his analytical mind at work. He looked at the brand new UN and pretty quickly expressed doubt. He pointed to the Security Council veto power and basically predicted it would paralyze the organization in major crises.
And his main takeaway?
He saw the future, and it was conflict. He predicted the coming struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the Cold War. He was absolutely convinced America couldn't retreat into isolationism again. It had to lead. Hashtag 3.1 transition to politics, philosophical core.
So journalism was brief. By 1947, he's running for Congress in Massachusetts.
And it was a full-on Kennedy operation. Joe Sr. bankrolled it heavily, pulled every string he could, called in favors, apparently even offered bribes to key Boston political figures. Classic Joe Sr. maneuver.
But the platform, the message, that was Jack.
Very much so. He worked closely with Ted Sorensen, who became his indispensable speechwriter and advisor. They crafted the policy positions, and the whole family mobilized. Rose, the sisters, Bobby, all hit the streets canvassing. Rose and the sisters hosted these fashionable teas for women.
Which was smart politics in that era.
Very smart. Targeted out. And it worked. He won the House seat at just 29.
Looking at his time in Congress and later the Senate, it's actually quite hard to label him politically, isn't it? He wasn't a straightforward liberal or conservative.
Not at all. The sources often describe him using 3 words: moderate, pragmatist, and real. That seems to capture it best.
Okay, break that down. Where do we see the progressive?
Well, he was definitely a supporter of the New Deal legacy. He fought for expanding Social Security, backed government help for affordable housing, generally pro-labor initiative, veteran benefits were important to him, and crucially, he supported the 1957 Civil Rights Act, even though it angered many Southern Democrats in his own party.
But then you look at other areas and he sounds more conservative.
Exactly, especially on foreign policy. He was a staunch Cold Warrior. Opposed McCarthy's tactics, but shared the underlying anti-communist sentiment. And economically, he pushed for income and corporate tax cuts.
Which sounds like classic Republican policy.
It does, but his reasoning was more Keynesian. The idea was that cutting taxes would stimulate the economy, boost demand, create growth, and ultimately bring in more tax revenue overall. Not just a giveaway to the rich, it was about pragmatic results.
Even his views on unions were new, right? Not typical conservative anti-unions.
Right. He wasn't necessarily against unions protecting workers, but he worried about them becoming too powerful, like entrenched bureaucracies that might stifle innovation or not truly represent the rank-and-file workers anymore. He distrusted any kind of rigid dogma, left or right.
He seemed consistently focused on civic duty, though, pushing back against cynicism.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme. Even back in a speech he gave at Choate, he quoted Rousseau. "As soon as any man says of the affairs of state, 'What does it matter to me?' state may be given up as law." He really believed democracy needed active citizens, people willing to engage, compromise, act in good faith. Given his family background, that emphasis on good faith is hashtag 3.2, the marriage that secured the wife.
So Jack's political career is taking off. He's in the Senate. But there's one thing missing, according to his father.
A wife. Joe Sr. apparently laid it on the line. Told Jack that being a bachelor in his 30s, especially aiming for the presidency, was a major political problem. It raised questions back then about maturity, serious, even, whispered, about sexual orientation.
Even though Jack had this reputation.
Oh yeah, the reputation was definitely there. Inveterate skirt chaser, as some sources put it. He was still kind of sloppy in his personal habits, the messy hair, rumpled clothes, but he carried it off with this incredible charm and wit. The bachelor image was part of his appeal, but Joe Sr. saw it as a liability for the top job.
And then, in 1951, he meets Jacqueline Bouvier.
Jackie. And she was immediately different from the women he usually dated. Yes, she was stunningly beautiful, but she had real substance. Intelligence, composure, sophistication.
Spoke multiple languages.
Fluent French, could converse in others, very cultured, interested in arts, history. She wasn't easily impressed just by the Kennedy name or money.
And the courtship wasn't straightforward. She wasn't swept off her feet immediately.
Not at all. She kept him at arm's length for a while, apparently told friends she doubted he was serious about settling down, called him a man who didn't seem to want to get married.
So how did he win her over?
Interestingly, not with flowers or fancy gifts. He sent her books. They bonded over literature, history. They recognized something in each other. Maybe both had used reading and creating an inner world as a way to cope with demanding families or social pressures. That intellectual connection.
They married in 1953, but by all accounts, it was a difficult marriage from the start.
It was definitely strained. Jack's infidelities didn't stop after the wedding. That was a constant source. Jackie, perhaps channeling some of Rose Kennedy's stoicism, seemed to adopt a policy of looking the other way as long as he was discreet and didn't publicly humiliate.
That must have been incredibly difficult and compounded by other stresses.
Absolutely. Jack worked incredibly long hours, totally focused on politics, and they had heartbreaking difficulty starting a family, a miscarriage, then the devastating stillbirth of their first daughter, Arabella. And Jack was away in Europe when Arabella was born.
Just awful. Yet, despite all that, when Jack's health crises hit hard, Jackie was incredibly loyal.
Utterly devoted. He had those terrible back problems needing multiple major surgeries. His Addison's flared up. There were times he was so ill in the hospital he was actually administered the last rites by a priest twice. And through all that, Jackie was right there, managing his care, protecting his image, providing support. That shared experience of his fragility, plus the shared grief over losing Arabella, it forged this deep, if complicated, bond. And eventually they had Caroline and John Jr. survive.
Okay, fast forward to 1906. Jack's now 43. He's got the war hero credentials, successful Senate career. He's even won a Pulitzer Prize for his book Profiles in Courage. Written another book too, A Nation of Immigrants. The country seems ready for a change for this younger generation. Hashtag 4.1, the 1960 election, and the television age.
And the 1960 election becomes this pivotal moment, largely because of television. It featured the first ever televised presidential debate, and they made a huge difference.
Kennedy just looked great on TV, didn't he? Young, handsome, tanned.
He did. He was coached on how to present himself for the camera. He looked relaxed, confident, polished. Jackie's influence was apparently felt too. Subtle upgrades to his suit, hair. He looked the part of a vigorous...
And
Nixon came across poorly visually. He'd been sick, looked pale and tired, famously refused to wear stage makeup, so he appeared sweaty under the hot studio light. And crucially, he kept directing his answers to the reporters in the room, not looking directly into the camera lens, which is where the real audience...
So the visual contrast was stark.
Hugely stark. Polls afterwards showed something interesting. People who listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon won, but people who watched on TV overwhelmingly gave the win. Image, presentation, it suddenly mattered enormously.
And Kennedy won, but just barely.
Incredibly close. Less than 1% of the popular vote separated. But he won, became the youngest elected president and the first Catholic president, and so began his time in office those 1,000 days, immediately dominated by the Cold War. Yeah, he came in as a committed Cold Warrior, no question. But his approach wasn't just about military strength. It was more multifaceted. He blended that resolve with diplomacy and also with using American resources for, well, soft power.
Like the Peace Corps.
Exactly, sending young, skilled Americans to help in developing nations, and the Alliance for Progress, pumping economic aid into Latin America, food for peace, using U.S. agricultural surpluses to fight hunger globally, trying to win hearts and minds, not just contain communism militarily.
But his presidency got off to a really rough start on foreign policy, didn't it? With Cuba.
Oh, the Bay of Pigs, a disaster. He inherited this plan from the Eisenhower administration, a CIA-backed attempt by Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro.
And it failed miserably.
Spectacularly. Within days, most of the invaders were captured or killed. Kennedy realized he'd trusted flawed advice from the CIA and the military. He went on TV and took full public responsibility, which was actually a smart political move, showed character. But the failure emboldened Khrushchev, the Soviet leader.
And the relationship got tense quickly. Over Berlin.
Very tense. Their first summit meeting didn't go well. Khrushchev felt he could push Kennedy around. And shortly after, in August 1961, the Soviets and East Germans built the Berlin Wall, physically dividing this, a stark, concrete symbol of the Cold War and an early setback.
But that tension was nothing compared to what came next, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
October 1962, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. American spy planes discovered the Soviets were secretly installing medium-range nuclear missile sites in Cuba. war, capable of hitting major U.S. cities within
90 miles off the coast of Florida. The panic must have been immense. How did Kennedy's team react?
There was intense pressure from some advisors, especially military leaders, for immediate action. Airstrikes against the missile sites, maybe even a full-scale invasion of Cuba.
Which could have triggered World War III.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
Soviet troops were in Cuba. They likely would have retaliated maybe against Berlin and then Kennedy resisted that immediate military response. He opted for something less aggressive initially.
The naval blockade.
He called it a quarantine, carefully avoiding the word blockade, which is technically an act of war. U.S. Navy ships surrounded Cuba to prevent any more Soviet ships carrying offensive weapons from reaching the island.
Buying time for diplomacy, but under unimaginable pressure.
13 days. The whole world was on edge. Secret negotiations were frantic. Back channels were used. It was incredibly tense.
And the resolution. How was war avoided?
It was a complex deal. Publicly, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba under UN supervision. The U.S. publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. But there was a secret part of the deal, too. The U.S. agreed to quietly remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey near the Soviet border. Missiles that were actually pretty obsolete by then. But it gave Khrushchev a way to save.
Did that crisis change Kennedy? His approach to the Soviets?
Profoundly, by all accounts. Staring into the nuclear abyss had a sobering effect. He shifted towards trying to manage the Cold War rather than just win it. It led directly to setting up the hotline, that direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, to prevent future misunderstandings escalating so dangerous.
And it pushed him towards arms.
Yeah. He became a strong advocate for and successfully negotiated the first nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets and the UK in 1993, banning atmospheric tests. A major step. Alongside all this, of course, he was also championing the space race.
Right, committing the U.S. to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Another front in the Cold War competition.
Exactly. Laying the groundwork for the Apollo program, even though he wouldn't live to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Hashtag 4.3 domestic agenda and civil rights.
Okay, let's turn to the domestic front. His agenda was called the New Frontier. Given he only had those 1,000 days, how much did he actually get rolling?
A surprising amount. The core idea of the New Frontier was progress, moving America forward. He pushed through those tax cuts, income and corporate, believing they'd stimulate growth.
But also expanded social programs?
Yes. He bolstered Social Security benefits, raised the federal minimum wage significantly, and got more federal funding for education passed. It was a mix of pro-growth and social safety net policies.
He also took steps on women's rights, didn't he?
He did. In 1962, he established the President's Commission on the Status of Women, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. It was the first time the federal government systematically studied discrimination against women in education, the workplace, legal rights, a really important first step that laid groundwork for later feminist movement.
But maybe the area where his views evolved most dramatically during his presidency was civil rights. He seemed hesitant at first.
He was initially quite cautious. Politically, he worried about alienating the powerful bloc of Southern Democrats whose votes he needed for other parts of his agenda. So he relied more on executive actions, appointing African Americans to federal positions, enforcing existing voting rights laws, rather than pushing for major new legislation initially.
But events on the ground forced his hand.
The sheer brutality faced by the freedom riders trying to integrate interstate buses, the violent resistance to integrating universities like Ole Miss, where federal troops had to be sent in, the horrific images coming out of Birmingham, Alabama, with police dogs, fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters, including children.
It became impossible to stay cautious.
Exactly. The moral imperative became overwhelming. That violence, broadcast on national television, shocked the nation and pushed Kennedy to take a much stronger public stand. He went on TV and framed civil rights as immoral fundamentally.
And the March on Washington in 1963 was a key moment.
Huge. Kennedy was apparently quite nervous about it beforehand, worried about potential violence or that it might backfire politically.
But Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech.
He watched the I Have a Dream speech live, and sources say he was profoundly moved by its power and its call to conscience. Immediately after the march, he invited Dr. King and other civil rights leaders to White House, signaling his full commitment to pushing for a comprehensive civil rights. That legislation would be his major unfinished business. Hashtag 4.4 assassination and the enduring legacy.
So you have this moment of hope, this sense of progress, particularly on civil rights. The Kennedys in the White House, young children, the glamour. That whole Camelot image was really taking.
It was an image of youth, energy, sophistication, optimism, which made what happened on November 22nd, 1903 in Dallas shatteringly tragic.
He was there on a political trip, wasn't he? Trying to mend fences within the Texas Democratic Party.
That's right. Riding in an open motorcade with Jackie beside him. When the shots were fired from the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald,
Kennedy was hit twice.
Once in the back and then the fatal shot to the head. Just devastating.
And the aftermath was pure chaos and confusion. Oswald
arrested quickly. But then, just 2 days later, while being transferred from the city jail, Oswald himself was shot and killed live on national television by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby.
Which just fueled suspicion immediately. How could this happen?
Exactly. Oswald claimed he was a patsy. Ruby claimed he acted out of grief and anger for Kennedy. The whole sequence felt wrong. Unbelievable.
The official investigation, the Warren Commission, concluded Oswald acted alone.
It did, but largely because Oswald was dead, because of the lingering questions, because of the sheer trauma of the event. That conclusion was just never accepted by a huge portion of the American public. Still isn't today. Conspiracy theories started almost immediately.
And this event, Kennedy's assassination, it feels like a real turning point, not just politically, but culturally, psychologically for America.
It absolutely was. It marked the end of a certain kind of post-war maybe even innocence. It ushered in an era of much deeper public cynicism about government, about trust eroded significantly after that. The historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. put it starkly. He said 4 events really defined 20th century America. Pearl Harbor, FDR's death, the moon landing in '69, and JF assassination. That profoundly #tag outro.
So when we step back from the Camelot myth, from the tragedy, and try to assess his legacy, why does he remain such an enduringly popular figure, consistently ranked highly by historians and the public?
It's a potent mix. The war hero status, the undeniable intelligence, the memorable speeches and writings, that incredible charisma, and then the timing of his death. He was struck down seemingly at the height of his powers, embodying hope, before the major disillusionments of Vietnam and Watergate. The Camelot myth froze him in time, forever young and full of promise.
But as we've discussed, a truly objective look, the kind this deep dive aims for, has to acknowledge the criticisms, the failures too.
Absolutely. You have to weigh the successes against the failure. The Bay of Pigs was a definite low point. The initial handling of Khrushchev arguably contributed to the Berlin Wall crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself, while resolved, brought the world terrifyingly close to annihilation due to mutual miscalculation and escalation.
And longer-term consequences.
Critics point to the administration's support for the coup against President Diem in South Vietnam, which destabilized the country further and deepened U.S. involvement that led to the Vietnam War. Some argue his economic policies, like tariff reductions, might have contributed to weakening American manufacturing down the line. And then, personally, the constant infidelity clearly clashes with the idealized image. It raises questions about character and integrity.
So we're left with this incredibly complex figure. Brilliant, flawed, driven, tragically cut short. A man wrestling with profound illness while projecting vitality, racing against a clock he believed was ticking down fast.
Which brings us back to that central question, maybe the unanswerable one that the sources implicitly raise. It's something for you, the listener, to really think about. Would John F. Kennedy be remembered with the same kind of reverence, that almost mythic status, if he hadn't been assassinated in 1903? If he'd lived to complete his term, maybe serve a second, face the escalating turmoil of the 60s.
Or was the tragedy itself, the martyrdom, the final necessary ingredient that cemented his place as a legendary figure, forever preserving Camelot by preventing the potentially messy realities that might have followed?
That's the lingering question. Was the myth created as much by his death as by his life?